Here.
Vice Chair Jim French,
Present.
Board Member Holmes. He's not present. Board Member Gail Johnson,
Present.
Board Member Bob Battaglia,
Present.
Board Member Jima Kasawi,
Present.
Board Member Ramin Kolasarki,
Present.
Board Member Nick Sitar,
Here.
Board Member Chris Ney.
Here.
Board Member Talia Travasoro, not present. Board Member Justin Vandiver,
Here.
Board Member Dilip Trivedi. And he didn't make it. And that's it. Thank you.
BCDC staff attending this afternoon include our Executive Director, Larry Goldspan, technical staff including myself, Ashley Tomerlin, Yuri Jewett, and Jen Hyman, and our Bay Adapt folks, Dana Breckald and Ethan Levine. With that, I will turn, meeting instructions, fun part. I want to share some instructions on how we can best participate in this meeting so it runs as smoothly as possible. For everyone online and in the meeting room, please make sure you have your microphones or your phones muted to avoid background noise. For board members, if you have a webcam, please make sure that it is on so everyone can see you. For members of the public, if you would like to speak during the public comment period, you will need to do so in one of three ways. First, if you are here with us in person, we will ask you to form a line near the staff table, and speaker cards are available at the door. You will be asked to come up to the mic one at a time to state your name, your affiliation, and provide your comments during the meeting. After all individuals who are present make their comments, we shall call on those participants who are attending remotely. The second way, if you are attending on the Zoom platform, please raise your virtual hand in Zoom. If you are new to Zoom and you joined our meeting using the Zoom application, click the hand at the bottom of your screen. The hand should turn blue when it is raised. Finally, if you are joining our meeting via phone, you must press *9 on your keypad to raise or lower your hand to make a comment, and *6 to mute or unmute your phone. We will call on individuals who have raised their hands in the order they are raised. After you are called on, you will be unmuted so that you can share your comments. Please state your name and affiliation at the beginning of your remarks. Remember, you have a limit of 3 minutes to speak on an item, and we will tell you when you have 1 minute remaining. Please keep your comments respectful and focused. We are here to listen to everyone who wishes to address us, but everyone has the responsibility to act in a civil manner. We will not tolerate hate speech, threats made directly or indirectly, and/or abusive language. We will mute anyone who fails to follow those guidelines or who exceeds the established time limits without permission. For public comments, if you are attending online, please note that we will only hear your voice and your video will not be enabled. If you are attending the meeting on the Zoom platform, we recommend using the gallery view option to view in view settings in order to see all the panelists. Audio for in-person panelists is recorded through the room's audio system and is not synced to individual panelists' videos. Finally, everyone now and then will hear me refer to the meeting host, Yuri. BCDC staff are acting as hosts for the meeting behind the scenes to ensure the technology moves the meeting forward smoothly and consistently. Please be patient with us if it's needed. And now I will turn the mic over to our Executive Director, Larry Goldspan.
We need to declare the meeting open, and since we have a quorum present, we are duly constituted to conduct business, so the meeting is declared open.
We okay, Ashley? There we go. Okay. And Yuri, would you please check to make sure that the gallery view is what is set for people who are not here? Ashley or Dana had a marvelous view of Tom Leader for about 5 minutes there, which was, and we like Tom, but it's not necessarily everybody. So thank you all for being here. My name is Larry Goldspan. I have the honor of being Executive Director of BCDC. I know some of you, not all of you, and I want to explain why that is. when I took this job, one of the things that I learned really quickly, and one of the things I'd learned actually earlier, is to learn very quickly what you don't want to know or what you don't need to know. And my predecessor, Will Travis, who was a professional architect, still is, I believe, was very cognizant of that. And I became very cognizant of that. And I realized early on in my tenure that I could not add anything to a DRB meeting because I don't do what you all do, and I don't see the world the way you all see. And candidly, that's good, because you all are tremendously creative and tremendously talented at what you do, and I'm simply not part of that. And candidly, the last thing I am is an engineer. And so my sitting in on an ECRB meeting is equivalent to when I started learning Hebrew, to be honest with you. And thankfully, you do read from left to right as opposed to right to left. But I simply couldn't really add anything to it. And so what I learned was that I needed to hire people who were really, really good at what you all do and learn how to lead you, which is why we have Jen and we have Ashley, because I think they do a tremendous job at helping you help us. And that's really what we ask you to do, to help you help us as we move forward on permits and all sorts of other things. With that being said, I think it was my idea, but I'm not positive, Ashley, to put you two, the DRB and the ECRB together to start understanding how BCDC is moving forward with regard to rising sea level in an overall policy context. You see this individually in your meetings. You talk about safety of fills, and you figure out how in the permit side a construction project needs to be put together to ensure safety of fills. But you really don't see the other parts of the project and how that really fits into resilience, the larger scope. You see these marvelous examples of how things are put together, but unfortunately or fortunately, BCDC receives projects on a parcel-by-parcel basis. And so you don't have necessarily, we have not enabled you to look at a larger scope, region-wide, sub-regionally, about how BCDC views resilience. You do a marvelous job at making sure the project is resilient and that the project has tremendous public access. But we want you today to start stepping back and to think a little bit larger about your jobs. Jobs, not as though we pay you a heck of a lot to be here, but your roles. How can we have you help us look at resilience in a larger scale? How can we have you help us think about what resilience means for public access and for safety on a larger scale? How can we be able to work with you in a way that enables you to help us on that larger scale? So what we're going to do today is introduce you to two really tremendous staff members, our assistant directors of planning and regulatory for climate change, who have been tasked with the very difficult responsibility of working with the community, working with stakeholders, and working with the commission to help them lead us through the issue of resilience, large scale, bay-wide. And we want you to step back and think, okay, I'm part of this now. How can I help? What does BCDC need to know? What do our commissioners need to know? What do our staffs need to know? What questions do we need to ask? So that's really the purpose of this discussion. And we want it to be a discussion. I don't know whether Dana, whether it's you or Ethan who have discussion questions that'll be put up, but there will be discussion questions put up that we hope you will actually try to answer. And if you can't answer them, let us know why you can't answer them and what we need to provide more information about or whatever to try to get those answers. Does that make sense to everybody? So that's why we're asking you to be here. So with that, I'm going to be quiet and turn it over to Jacinta.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Ashley, and thank you all the team here from BCDC for staging the meeting today. We really appreciate it, and I know on behalf of the DRB, this is something that I think as we have been evolving over the last 10 years, that a number of us have been on the board, you know, this question of thinking about the bigger picture is something that's been pretty consuming for us, and we've certainly been evolving in that direction. So I think today's session is going to be of incredible value. And look, just with the opportunity here today, because I think we don't get together face to face very often. In fact, I think this is the first time in 10 years. Second time. Yeah, maybe I missed the first time somehow. But I think it's incredibly important for the different disciplines to get together in this dialogue. I don't think there's any difficulty amongst any of our DRB members in weighing in with questions and asking appropriate questions. And I think these questions of resilience and sea level rise, climate change, the implications for the projects we're reviewing have become just more and more compelling, especially in the last, I'd say the last probably 4 years. You know, it's become quite challenging reviewing some of the projects with the limitations of the site to, you know, to be able to really speak to. So I'm very excited to be able to have that opportunity with everyone today. And look, I do want to welcome, we haven't got everyone here today, but we do have new board members and alternates that are just coming on board. And we have Yanita Anand with us today, a new board member. We also have Leo Chow, new board member, and alternates, Patricia Fonseca, Cody Anderson. Who else? That's it, and potentially more alternates. But I really see this as, you know, we're talking about resilience in the Bay today, but I think resilience in each of the boards is also really important. And, you know, four of us, I think, have been on the board for close to 10 years. And so I am very excited, as my colleagues are, about having new people come in so that we can sort of carry forward with a lot of strength and become better as we go forward into these pretty challenging times. So thanks again for organizing today, and we're looking forward to it. So it's over to ECRB.
Okay, well, thank you, Jacinta. I'm Rod Iwashta. I'm the chair of ECRB. And this is a really wonderful opportunity for all of us to get together and think and take that step back that Larry's talking about to consider sea level rise and other changing conditions that are going to happen. ECRB's goal, or our goal has been to look at the safety of fills for individual projects. And I think we've started to talk about sea level rise and what we need to do. I've been, in my day job, I've a little concerned that sometimes we are overreaching, but I'm here to learn and talk and kind of share my opinion. And I'm sure all of our board members as well have their opinions. We've had some pretty good conversations over the last couple of meetings, and I welcome this all, and thanks again for organizing.
So I'd like to introduce Dana Breckwold and Ethan Levine, who will be presenting the Bay Adapt briefing today.
Thanks, Ashley. We're just getting our presentation set up. One second. Okay. Thanks for having us today. I'm Dana Breckwald. I'm the Assistant Planning Director for Climate Adaptation, and I oversee our Bay Adapt initiative as well as our Adapting to Rising Tides program. So I'm going to walk you through the first part of the conversation and then turn it over to Ethan. So could you go to the next button? Ethan's sitting right next to me for those of you not in the room. So if I turn my head a lot, it's to speak to him in person. So today we really want to give you an overview of our major Bay Adapt initiatives, how Bay Adapt came around, what we're doing now, and then as you listen to our presentation, here are our discussion questions we've posed, although of course the discussion can go really any way that we see fit. So for you as board members, how and when would you like to engage in the Bay Adapt process and the projects that we have going on right now? And then what do we not know about? What resources would you recommend to support these initiatives? There's a lot of information out there that's already been thought of around sea level rise adaptation, and we want to make sure that we're being additive and not duplicative in our work. Sorry, okay, there we go. So I'm sure you're all at least somewhat familiar with sea level rise vulnerability here in the Bay Area. But what I like to remind people at every presentation that I give is that while this is a California coastal-wide issue, it will be felt most acutely here in the Bay, with 2/3 of the impacts in the state occurring here along our Bay shoreline. And also that climate change is not just a tomorrow problem. Temporary flooding today at king tides signals the areas that will be permanently underwater in the future. And in addition to overtopping, we're also facing erosion along our shoreline edges, beaches and wetlands, and groundwater rise. This is a multifaceted issue that is real for us today. When we look at the interconnected systems across the Bay Area that will be impacted if nothing is done, a stark picture emerges. In as little as 40 years, we could see impacts to our up to 5 million daily car commuters and 60,000 rail commuters. Tens of thousands of existing housing units and planned housing units, as well as existing jobs and planned jobs, nearly 30,000 socially vulnerable residents, and 20,000 acres in depressional wetlands, lagoons, and tidal marshes that could drown. So it doesn't really matter if you personally live near the shoreline, this will impact everyone in the Bay Area. But it also is true that in the Bay Area, many aspects of sea level rise vulnerability have been extensively studied already at both the local and regional level. So these maps show what we have called hotspots in our 2020 ART Bay Area report, or areas where flooding impacts multiple critical assets at once, like transportation infrastructure, vulnerable communities, job centers, housing growth areas, and natural conservation areas. The two maps, the one on the left shows early hotspots at 24 inches of water, and what would emerge later at 48 inches. You notice on the maps, TWL stands for total water level, which is a term that the Adapting to Rising Tides program uses in our Bay Shoreline Flood Explorer to describe any combination of permanent inundation and temporary flooding. So for example, 24 inches of total water level could mean 24 inches of permanent inundation, similar to what we may see around 2060, or it could represent 12 inches of inundation and a king tide, which we'll see sooner before 2050. So recently, BCDC partnered with MTC ABAG to develop a cost estimate for how much this is all going to cost. This study was focused on protecting 4.9 feet of total water level, which is our best estimate for permanent inundation and a 100-year storm by 2050. And the cost estimate was developed by inventorying existing and planned projects, as well as creating hypothetical placeholder projects for areas of the shoreline that will experience overtopping by 2050, but don't yet have a project identified or planned. So the total that we came up with in this study is a need for $110 billion for shoreline adaptation by 2050, which includes $52 billion in known or planned projects, and as well as $3 billion for sediment needs. And this map that you're seeing here shows the total for the region broken down by project type, gray, hybrid, green, or placeholder project, as well as by county. Not yet. While 110 billion may seem like a staggering amount of money, we also know that if we fail to adapt, our losses by 2050 could be in the magnitude of 230 billion or greater as private property and infrastructure become flooded and lose their function. So, without a doubt, sea level rise is going to require a radical reimagining of our base shoreline, as well as how we make decisions about how to proceed as a region. Adaptation is already occurring locally, but it's not likely to happen fast enough, efficiently enough, or in a way that advances our larger regional goals if it occurs on a site-by-site or city-by-city basis. This is largely because flooding doesn't follow jurisdictional boundaries, but on the flip side, decisions made along one part of the shoreline can have unintentional impacts in neighboring jurisdictions. Frontline communities are most impacted and have the fewest resources to adapt without additional support. Essential habitats such as wetlands are at the front lines and at risk of being lost. There's currently a patchwork of approaches along the shoreline, not a cohesive strategy. There's a different use and interpretation of, quote, best available science. There's limited funding available, and if everyone goes it alone, there will be greater competition for funding, and we're less likely to seek collaborative multi-benefit opportunities. And ultimately, without working together to define a shared vision of what we want to achieve, we can't know if we're moving towards success or what success for our region even means. So this is where BayAdapt comes in. In early 2020, BCDC started with a hypothesis. Can we bring together leaders across a wide variety of sectors, public, private, community, nonprofit, and academic, and come up with a consensus-driven strategy that lays out the actions necessary to adapt the San Francisco Bay shoreline to rising sea level to protect people and the natural and built environment. BayAdapt was guided by a set of guiding principles developed by our leadership advisory group, and these served as our North Star throughout the process and included things like putting socially vulnerable communities first, solving interconnected problems at the same time, recognizing that we need to support existing efforts but also plan for the long term, and also recognizing that strategies will be different in different locations and at different times. So the culmination of the BayAdapt efforts thus far over the course of 2 years was the adoption of the BayAdapt Joint Platform in October 2021. We engaged with over 360 participants through public workshops, worked with 81 practitioners and experts through multiple working groups, including a local elected officials, staff, and technical advisors. We held focus groups, including with community-based organizations, environmental groups, business groups, and planners, and gave over 50 presentations around the region. The joint platform identifies 9 actions and 21 tasks that don't specify specific projects along the shoreline, but instead are designed to overcome common barriers and set the stage for faster, more equitable adaptation. It has since been endorsed by over 50 cities, counties, and special interest groups. Since the adoption of the joint platform, we've identified and received funding for 4 major undertakings to implement the tasks in the joint platform. First, building on our equity principles, we are focusing on frontline communities, particularly disadvantaged and low-income communities of color, primarily at this point through the development of a region-wide shoreline leadership academy. Second, we are leading the development of a regional shoreline adaptation plan, which I'll describe to you next. Third, we'll focus on regulatory improvements. You'll hear from Ethan about this task. And then lastly, we are committed to continuing to serve as what we're calling the backbone agency for BayAdapt. That means keeping the conversations going, convening, coordinating, and tracking and reporting our region's successes and progress. So I want to go into some detail now about the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan. This is one of the major components we see your 2 boards could potentially offer some valuable insight. The Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan wasn't actually specifically outlined in the joint platform, but it is named in BCDC's 2011 climate change policies and draws on several tasks in the joint platform, such as setting a standard vision for what adaptation success looks like for the region, supporting local planning to coordinate towards regional goals, linking pots of money towards voluntary compliance with standardized guidelines, and tracking the region's progress towards this vision that we've established. So the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan will create common standards, goals, and priorities, aka what we're calling guidelines, for multi-jurisdictional adaptation plans. The projects identified in these plans, once they're created, will together form a comprehensive plan for the Bay shoreline. We're working with a 40-person advisory group to develop the guidelines based on a long-term regional vision and engaging around the region to ensure that the guidelines enhance rather than hold back adaptation planning already underway. There's also active legislation on the table this year that would mandate BCDC to review and approve sub-regional adaptation plans. It remains to be seen if the plans that we're outlining here will be voluntary or mandatory. So if you think back to the slide that I showed earlier that highlights the challenges of not approaching adaptation region-wide, the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan is designed to conveniently avoid many of these pitfalls. So we think that the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan could result in adaptation that coordinates neighboring jurisdictions and, in fact, finds multi-benefit from improved collaboration, provides priority access to resources to frontline communities, enhances the long-term wealth and health of wetlands, and increased habitat diversity and abundance, provides a strategy for how implementation should proceed around the regions so that it occurs at the right time and the right place, develops common standards and methods for applying science, which can be supported by our own data and mapping work, creates a funding pipeline that reduces burdens on local jurisdictions, and gives us the ability to track and evaluate our collective vision of progress. So rather than a single document or plan, we're using the term Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan to actually describe three key parts. The first is developing a regional sea level rise adaptation planning guidelines. These guidelines will establish a common approach to local adaptation planning and be rooted in our shared vision and region-wide adaptation goals. The second part is providing funding and technical assistance to apply these guidelines towards multiple sub-regional or multi-jurisdictional adaptation plans around the region. And lastly, we're developing an online mapping platform that will be used first to help users access relevant regional information to prepare these sub-regional plans. But once these plans are completed, the strategies that are locally identified in these plans will be knit together at a regional level to form a comprehensive plan for the entire Bay shoreline. This work will be phased, with the creation of the guidelines occurring between now and the end of 2024. Then we'll transition into the development, supporting the development of the plans. And the mapping platform will be developed simultaneously with two distinct phases. First, building the platform as a support tool for developing the sub-regional plans, and then a second phase where the information from the completed sub-regional plans will be fed back into the mapping platform. So these sub-regional plans are really a critical piece of the overall puzzle. We're still working out exactly what they will look like, but we know that each one will include vulnerability assessments that's somewhat standardized across the region in terms of what science it uses and what it assesses. We know that they will identify and evaluate adaptation options in a way that uses a common set of considerations across the region, and that they should all include a quote, final option, adaptation pathway for all vulnerable sections of the shoreline. This final option is what will then be fed back into the region-wide mapping platform. So the guidelines that we'll be developing should be comprehensive and standardized while still reflecting local conditions and needs. While this list here is still in flux, these are the topic areas that we believe the plan should include, so the topics that we will need to develop guidelines on. Obviously, each of these topics contains many facets, and we're currently in the process of adding detail. And these topics have been identified because they are responsive to known risks from sea level rise in the Bay Area. They acknowledge shared land boundary of flooding impacts or implementation coordination and or cross-bay impacts. They address networked systems or biophysical connectivity, and they reflect our regional priorities. I also just want to set out since we don't have the guidelines yet, some expectations about what we think they actually are and what they are not. So first, what the guidelines are envisioned to be. I know we use the term guidelines a lot to describe project design guidelines, but these are guidelines to guide the creation of plans, not necessarily projects. They will be best practices for vulnerability assessments, identifying and evaluating the shoreline plan, and developing adaptation pathways that consider issues the region thinks are important. At this point, as I said, they're voluntary, non-enforceable, incentive-driven. We want them to be aligned with existing planning processes, especially if a city already has some sort of adaptation plan in place. And importantly, not all guidelines will be applicable everywhere. So they're applicable only where they're relevant in the region, i.e. where a condition exists that the guideline applies to. As I said, they're not project design guidelines. They're not mandatory or enforceable by BCDC permitting or other legal authority. We don't want them to be an additional burden on top of existing planning processes. And they aren't intended to be top-down blanket rules that don't consider local conditions, needs, or values. So lastly, we have planned significant engagement with stakeholders as part of the process of developing these guidelines. We have a handful of leadership groups that are directly helping to guide this process. Beginning in August, we're kicking off our regional vision and goals phase, which will include pop-up events and a public workshop. November through July, we will actually be drafting these regional guidelines, which will include a number of local meetings as well as 2 additional public workshops. And we aim to go to public comment in August and September of 2024. We could also do potential additional focus groups, presentations as requested, and of course, we are looking to see how we can continue to engage with these 2 groups as well as part of our engagement. So at that, I will turn it over to Ethan.
Thanks, Dana. Sorry for stepping on a few of your slides. I have a hair trigger here on my computer. But good afternoon, board members. I'm Ethan Levine, and I'll be introducing a new effort that we're working on under BayAdapt banner on regulatory improvements for both BCDC's program and the way that we coordinate with our regulatory partners. So why are regulatory improvements an area of focus for BayAdapt and for BCDC? First and foremost, the need for this work became evident because of the consensus-driven planning process that created the BayAdapt Joint Platform. And the stakeholders who took part in that effort identified that getting adaptation projects approved by regulatory agencies and getting them built can be a big challenge. So they laid out a vision that permitting should not hold back, but actually accelerate resilient shoreline adaptation projects that align with regional goals. And there's more. There's a few things that have to do with how BCDC hopes to grow as an agency. First, our recently adopted strategic plan. The new strategic plan stresses the importance of closely integrating our regulatory and long-range planning efforts to better succeed in adaptation planning. And second, we're developing a racial equity action plan that will identify objectives for improving our permitting program to advance equitable outcomes and achieve greater community engagement in decision-making. So that was all why we are working on it, and the rest of the presentation is going to be about how we're going to go about it. And when we initially presented this concept to a select group of commissioners, one cautioned us that changing the process isn't going to be enough, and paraphrased a quote by the management consultant Peter Drucker, who said, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast." What he meant is that establishing new rules, policies, or procedures often doesn't work if the people who apply them or implement them haven't embraced the mindset behind the changes. And that's because people can always have rigid or unrealistic interpretations that frustrate the intended changes. So for all that we admire about BCDC's culture, recognizing that it needs to evolve in response to the changing world, the question is, well, how do we do that? And we came across a study that they're really happy to see that actually helps us sort of conceptualize how that might work. There was a really fascinating paper published a few months ago by Dr. Amy Mickle from Cal State Sacramento. And Dr. Mickle looked at the Cutting the Green Tape initiative, which many of you will have heard of. It's been embraced by the California Natural Resource Agency and many of the departments and agencies that are working in the state, including BCDC. And Cutting Green Tape aims to increase regulatory and permitting efficiency for multi-benefit environmental restoration projects in California. Dr. Mickle says that cutting green tape may be on the verge of shifting the paradigm around the problems it's setting out to address. And to make the case, Mickle borrows from the work of historian and philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn, who introduced the term paradigm shift. I'm just going to describe quickly what Kuhn's idea on the paradigm shift was. And looking at science, Kuhn said that science doesn't actually follow a gradual linear evolution towards truth, but that rather it goes through big changes when established theories simply don't hold up anymore. So the changes in ideas can be rapid and they can turn everything on their head, like how scientific thought changed radically with the emergence of germ theory or Darwin's theory on natural selection. Here's how the process works. It starts with the current well-established paradigm. That's the current way of doing business. When something occurs outside of the paradigm, that is, it no longer makes sense in certain circumstances, it's initially viewed as an anomaly. And when there are many anomalies, people start looking for new explanations and ways of doing things. At some point, a tipping point is reached, and the current paradigm no longer works under the conditions, and there's a shared perception of an impending crisis. People respond by developing new ways of thinking, and alternative paradigms are developed. Eventually, an alternative idea that does a better job of explaining the anomalies than the current one does emerge, and it's embraced. And at that point, a revolution occurs where people embrace the new idea and it becomes the usual way of doing things. And as a result, the paradigm shifts and the alternative paradigm replaces the previous one. So how does that hold up with cutting green tape? Is it shifting the paradigm? We start by defining the current paradigm. It's the model we're familiar with for environmental regulation, and it's behind the types of laws and the frameworks that BCDC uses and that many other regulators have, which are based on preventing harm to the environment through strict enforcement of what can sometimes be a cumbersome regulatory process. And that worked really well in the context in which it was created. And California was able to avoid significant damage to its environment by instituting a complex set of processes to review projects. Even if this complexity sometimes came at the cost of time, effort, and money for the people trying to get projects built. Dr. Mickle says that climate change is the anomaly that's challenging the status quo. Its harmful effects on people and the environment is already evident and will continue to emerge rapidly. The current paradigm does not make sense for restoration and other environmentally beneficial projects that are necessary responses to this threat, though, because it slows them down, and we need them fast. So for years, our colleagues inside and outside of government have studied, written about, and proposed alternative solutions for how regulators should approach climate adaptation. But also something really interesting about paradigm shifts is that they happen when they're embodied by practitioners, not necessarily just theorists or outside critics. And this point goes back to the comment that culture eats strategy. Dr. Mickle interviewed practitioners and concluded that a tipping point has been reached because they recognize the current paradigm is contributing to the crisis, and practitioners, including all of us here, are beginning to really evaluate the way that we do our work. Dr. Mickle thinks this means that we might be entering the final shift of this age, and we'll know that we've achieved a culture shift when the agencies permanently reject those aspects of the old way of doing business that contribute to problems of slowing down environmentally beneficial projects. And I really do want to stress here that this is not a throw the baby out with the bathwater kind of situation. It doesn't mean eliminating permits or foregoing analysis necessary to prevent environmental harm. Rather, it means elevating the goals of effective nature-based and equitable adaptation and ensuring that the old safeguards don't prevent us from succeeding in the face of the newer challenge. But where they do, we need to look at how to change them. So you could look at all of this as an effort that we're trying to do to shift the paradigm here at BCDC. And to the extent that we can be effective in promoting it more widely within the larger regulatory environment for San Francisco Bay. We're trying to make that happen by identifying the anomalies that are challenging our existing program finding new alternative means of addressing what's not working well as it needs to, and engaging in discrete projects that will result in shifts in thinking and shifts in action. We've identified 5 key actions, sorry about that we're going to focus on in our work. And the first one shown here is that we're working to make permitting faster and more efficient. So we need to spend less time and fewer resources permitting adaptation projects that do align with the regional goals that Dana was discussing. Instead of relying on doing things the way they've always been done, we'll make changes to make our process more efficient and predictable. And the goal is to reduce the amount of time and money that good projects spend in order to obtain permits and regulatory approvals. Second, we're working to navigate our regulatory program to make it easier to navigate. Well, we don't want applicants or the public to be uncertain about how BCDC works or what our goals are. So we'll develop resources so that less time and effort goes into understanding our program and then more goes into working together to build good projects. Third is we want to remove roadblocks to effective nature-based adaptation projects. We've committed through BayAdapt to prioritize natural infrastructure solutions that benefit ecosystems and the health of the bay. These projects present some unique challenges for permitting because they involve uncertainty, whether that's because the efficacy of certain approaches hasn't been firmly established yet, or because we may have to consider trade-offs between certain ecosystem functions. So we're planning to put time and effort into addressing the problems, and we will work to convince the applicants who might undertake these projects that we're a partner to work with and not an obstacle that they need to overcome amongst many others. Fourth, we're going to work together with our regulatory partners. We certainly can't go it alone. BCDC is just one of many agencies that plays a part in reviewing and approving the adaptation projects the region needs to build. So we can do a better job of coordinating, aligning our processes, and possibly even piloting new approaches that vastly streamline the process adaptation projects need to navigate to win their approvals. And last, we're working to reimagine BCDC's roles in the region. Adaptation presents issues that were never considered when the legislature wrote the laws that established BCDC's authority and jurisdiction. So building on the outcomes of the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, we'll take a close look at whether the region has the regulatory framework it needs to ensure equitable and effective adaptation outcomes. If there are gaps that BCDC could fill, we'll work with commissioners, board members, and other interested people and organizations to understand how we might evolve as an agency to help implement the region's adaptation vision. This is a very simplified version of the work plan. We're in the first stage where we're assessing the current challenges and the methods to address these challenges. So I just want to highlight 2 projects that we're working on as part of this assessment. The first one is with the Department of Finance, who we've engaged with to conduct a mission-based review of our permitting program. And that mission-based review is going to focus really heavily on finding efficiencies in our existing permitting process. It's a pretty unique opportunity for us to have a small expert team come in from the outside and review our program. And we're going to get some recommendations from the really great staff there to help us find improvements in our existing workflow. The second is some background research that one of our newest staffers, Dominic McCormick, who's in the room, Dominic, you can wave, has undertaken. He just joined us in May, but in the last month, dove right in and analyzed a great wealth of research and policy work related to this very challenge. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So Dominic identified 31 recommendations that provide a menu of options for us to consider as potential avenues for further work. For example, one of the big lessons that Dominic identified was there are a very large range of opportunities for us to coordinate permitting review with our other regulatory partners. These include everything from aligning policies and practice, and could even include implementing new forms of integrated permitting to streamline adaptation projects approval processes. So after we assess, we're going to take the findings of the assessment and create a plan that prioritizes key projects and initiatives. and defines the needed resources and timelines to undertake these and actually sets out a roadmap for implementation. And then, of course, comes the work to advance and implement our projects. So that work involves work internal to BCDC, as well as the work that we undertake in joint partnership with our regulatory partners to help achieve better outcomes on adaptation projects. So that's where we're headed. We'll provide you with updates as we define our priorities and begin to implement our projects. And of course, today we're really interested, as we move into the discussion, to hear more about how you think this work might interface with the processes that are happening at these two boards. Just a plug, if you want to know more about any of the content you heard about today or dive in on the joint platform, BayAdapt has a newly updated website, bayadapt.org. I believe we're going to pause here to do public comment, and then after the public comment is over, we'll put some discussion questions up on the board for you. Thanks.
Thank you, Ethan and Dana. If you're attending online and would like to make a public comment, please raise your virtual hand to speak. Remember, if you're joining our meeting via phone, you must press *9 or your keypad to raise your hand to make a comment, and to unmute yourself, press *6. It looks like we have no public comment. So we will take it to board clarifying questions and discussion.
And I'll just, before we start out, here's the discussion questions we posed for you, and of course we welcome any other thoughts. But initially we put up, as advisory board members, how and when would you like to participate and engage in the efforts we just presented, and what resources would you recommend to support these initiatives?
Okay, well, there's a great deal to digest there, and thank you both for those excellent presentations. Dana and Ethan, a couple of us had the opportunity to participate in this just, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and I can see you're already, making a lot more progress. So, super impressive. Thank you. So, I'm just thinking to make this as valuable as possible for the from the DRB standpoint. I'm sure everyone will have some questions, but I think one way to get at these two questions and perhaps some other reactions would be to think about the challenges that we have encountered when we've been reviewing projects in the last couple of years. And that's sort of extending out from, to the ultimate step in the work that you're doing. But I really think that in these challenges, bigger picture thinking, to really succeed, you've got to be able to move from, region down to site, back up to region to test. And I think, that will be something that we should, as a board, think about appropriate points to engage with you on, because, we are looking at that site-specific challenge of adaptation all the time. So we could think about that in the context of the timelines that you showed and some key steps. I think we'd all be really happy to engage with you at appropriate points along that timeline. There were a couple of things that it's not exactly addressing those two questions, but a couple of things struck me, and it really relates to some of the challenges that we see. And I think the first point I would talk to is just the sub-regional adaptation plan, so the progress that you're showing there. And I think one of the struggles we have is, you had a slide that showed all the issues that you're considering in those. And I think that's sort of the fundamental challenge of land use, and current land use designation is something that we struggle with. Should we even be reviewing a housing project, in this position along the bay? So, I'll just put that out there. We don't have to talk about this right now. We might want others to weigh in with other things that struck them. But I do think if we're looking at a sort of a longer-term integrated view around the bay, I think this question of land use designation becomes really critical. And then I think two other things that strike me, because we talk about these issues all the time, you know, in the anomalies, you know, versus nature, things that are being done versus nature-based adaptation. And we talk about this a lot, and Bob often takes the lead. Thank you, Bob, for moving us in that direction so well. But I think there's often a challenge about, you know, the consideration of the 200-foot designation that we have to where we really, you know, have the primary responsibility to determine, you know, how access is provided, but importantly, you know, how, you know, a nature-based adaptation plan might work. And I think sometimes you know, we're not always debating closely about, you know, what could be done in that band or could extend further on. But I think as we get deeper into this process, it might be good longer term, you know, looking out over the horizon and the bigger picture to sort of think, is that 200-foot band? How do we think about that down the track? And then I think the other question that comes up with us quite often now is this question of fill. And certainly when we all, 10 years ago, you know, that was a line you really didn't cross. You know, we didn't talk about, we tried to avoid filling the bay. But in nature-based adaptation solutions, you know, sometimes, I'm sure the ECRB talks about this a lot, but you know, the question of, you know, some fill to accomplish a better outcome for nature-based adaptation could be, you know, worthwhile thinking about. So I think that issue is something, you know, that we could spend some time on refining. I love the fact that you're all reimagining BCDC's role in the region. I mean, I just think this is a very exciting time for BCDC because, you know, you're stepping up, taking a strong leadership role. It's always hard to see around the corner, you know, where is this leading? But I think the anomaly example that diagram you showed us is, you know, I completely agree that we are at the point where we're sort of looking around the corner on that diagram to, you know, where a new paradigm shift, just the way sustainability was a massive paradigm shift back in the early 2000s. You know, no one talked about sustainability. Everywhere else in the world, people, well, not everywhere, but in a lot of developed countries, they had been talking about sustainability for 10 years and doing great work in that area. And then America, United States got on board, and suddenly this tidal wave of change happened. So, you know, that anomaly diagram is very important. So, look, with that, I'm just going to hand to other members here to just build on those few points, take other points. Stefan, do you want to lead off? We'll just come down the line, I think.
Sure, I'll try to go first here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for those presentations. It's actually really beneficial to have a better understanding of what you all have been working on. I don't know how to answer these questions, but I'd like to build on a couple of things that you said, and then Jacinta, and then maybe that will raise some other issues. One of the key things that comes up for me when thinking about a sub-regional adaptation plan is the vehicle through which that gets implemented, and that the jurisdictions were setting an expectation. I think I'm understanding this, that they would do some area planning at a local level that would actually address these issues that you're providing guidance before locally. And you mentioned vulnerability, shoreline adaptation, and the notion of creating an adaptation pathway. And that, you know, in my other day job, I see this through the lens of housing, you know, housing production and what the state's doing to basically accelerate that. And the notion that most planners are actually really greatly overburdened. Cities don't have a lot of extra capacity, and there's always that notion of like, oh my gosh, I have to do another plan. Like, I have to participate in this other thing. I have to deal with this whole other thing that goes beyond my capacity, but also my area of expertise, and sort of looking at it through that lens. Those of us who are planners who are doing this work, but we're not necessarily trained to do this work, and sort of understanding that burden. But I'm also thinking about the notion that our role becomes more important when the difference between what the local jurisdiction is telling the applicant to do and what BCDC is telling the applicant to do are far apart from one another. And this notion of us actually sort of providing discretionary guidance about what happens in that shoreline band becomes more important when there's not clarity between those two agencies. And Burlingame is a community that they made a effort to engage in shoreline planning through their general plan and through their update to their zoning ordinance in a way that you could say it actually it increases the amount of clarity between what's being proposed and this sort of gray area. That happens a lot where we're in situations where we raise this question about what should be suitable in the shoreline band, and the local jurisdiction says, well, you know, our building setback is actually only 10 feet. And, you know, this has gone through all of these approvals, so there's not much we can do at this point because, you know, we've given sort of permission. So I guess the shoreline adaptation plan being able to reduce the difference between those two or be a mechanism for that, but also provide some guidance for the jurisdiction, the entity that needs to implement the plan. Like, how do they do this? Is it another chapter to the general plan? Does OPR provide guidance for that so that it's really easy for them to understand what those expectations are? Those are some questions that I think that are sort of going on in my mind. And then the last thing I'll say now, and then maybe I can talk more later, is this this idea that at least at the state level, there's a lot of legislation that is geared towards incentivizing entities to do the right thing. And so I'm asking this question about could there be sort of a pathway to streamlining where habitat creation and sort of a more objectively defined outcome for what happens in the shoreline band would actually result in minimizing or reducing the need for discretionary review of that project? Would there be an incentive to say, you know what, we need to come to the board to make these decisions around permitting when what's happening in the shoreline band is not clear, but if 100% of the shoreline band is actually being created and reserved for habitat restoration and public access, does it reduce our role, or does it reduce the necessity of our role, or does it actually potentially reduce the timeline or promote a streamlined outcome that actually can accelerate the entity of that project? I'm going to make one more comment and then I'll shut up. What strikes me too about the sub-regional adaptation plan is that the jurisdictions play a role. Locally in jurisdictions, there are silos that need to be overcome, and that, like the shoreline adaptation plan, in some situations, it could be entirely on private landowners, or it could become a land use regulatory issue. In other situations, it could be, wow, 70% of our shoreline band is actually public right-of-ways, and public works actually needs to be the primary decision maker, the primary implementer. And we see a lot of projects where by the time it gets to us, the hurdle of crossing those silos at the local jurisdictional level has not been made. Right? We see a project through the lens of planning. You ask a question related to public works, and they say, "Well, we talked about that early on, but there was no way to collaborate within the jurisdiction, within the silos, and so we couldn't think more creatively about something like shoreline adaptation." And there's other parts of the Bay Area where Caltrans and railroads, regional transportation systems, they are going to play an outsized role in what happens at the shoreline, and they would sort of need to be involved. And that's a big question mark for me about how it happens consistently and how they can come to the table in a way that actually has a consistently productive outcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tom?
Thanks for your presentation. I'm in total concurrence with everything Stefan said, and I just have really more generalized, maybe abstract sort of view of the subject, I guess. And I think touching on incentives is critically important in this work. I think that incentives and motivations have to be understood, evaluated, and quantified. Like, why do I want to do this? I don't understand why I want to do this. Well, you're supposed to. Well, that's the problem, because canceling a negative, that doesn't get you anywhere better. And people, mayors, policy people, they want to enlarge their reputations. They want to, have a feather in their cap, or developers want to make money, or all these kinds of things that actually make projects proceed. Is the sense that we're going to be better off. We're going to be have our growth will be accelerated, and we can quantify that. We can understand dollars and cents how we will be benefited on a precise schedule. Otherwise, we don't understand what you're talking about. We just don't have resources or understanding for that. So I don't know how that's done exactly. How motivation and incentive, these kinds of ways of measuring value for people can enter this process, but it seems like it's critical. And people need to envision what could be, and this, from the design side, we have tools we can use to energize people, renderings, videos, stories, things like that will kind of help them imagine something they haven't seen yet. It's always critical. As a designer, you have to convince somebody that this really could be, and this is how it could proceed and be done. And there have to be, I think, credible. There have to be credentials. There's got to be some increment for which everybody can say this works and this got done, and we can see the path, and we can see the benefit and the value. We can count up how many people are benefited. We can count up how much money somebody made. Whatever it is, they would get people out of the chair and really want to do something. Like, I don't know, just some of the different initiatives we've been involved in the last 10 years. It's always there's some voice that is there saying, I don't have time for this. Why do I want to do this? That's the basic question. And I'm not very good at identifying all the policies and directives that will bring that about. But it seems like that's kind of the key. Having credentials that people can cite. I think it was 50th anniversary of BCDC. Was it 10 years ago now? And there was kind of a forum, Sportatorium, I think it was, and Bill McDonough came to that, and he was, and probably all heard this, but he was saying, it's just no good, just canceling a negative. The project has to not only help people, save people, but it's got to advance into positive territory, and that's kind of where I came off thinking that in the work we were doing, we had to do that. And as designers, we do have that potential. We do have the tools, but we need hard-nosed engagement with economics and politics to generate real serious motivation. I think every project needs to answer the question, why do I want to do this, for a number of people. I'm sorry, this is so abstract, but it's just thinking about this for a period of time now. It's kind of seems like and without motivation, I see difficulties advancing. That's all. Right.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, very helpful. Yanit, any comments?
I think just to start off, I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first hearing, and I'm still getting my bearings as a design board member. So this is a very exciting presentation. Thank you for all the details that were shared. I'm thrilled to see the vision and the big ambitions of thinking of this holistically as a bay, and that is some of the roadblock that I see in my day job as an urban designer, is the very narrow blinders of specific projects that we have. So I have a couple of very specific questions, the first of which is around the sub-area plans, and if there will be guidance that will either lay out a foundation or a framework or provide incentives for cross-sub-area or cross-project coordination, and how can we help streamline that or create systems that different jurisdictions could latch onto, so that this can help become a useful tool for some of those silos that both of you were describing. That, and then a second question around, I think, Dana, you touched on, it remains to be seen how voluntary or mandatory some of these guidance might end up being, and I'm curious to understand what the pathway for that decision of the level of teeth that some of these guidance pieces could have is, and how much of that is already happening and underway, and what milestones there might be to making those decisions. And do you anticipate that they may vary kind of jurisdiction to jurisdiction, or is it a similar level of teeth for the Bay as a whole? And I guess just, more looking forward to keeping up with some of this work and on the milestones and when and how. I think it would be very helpful to hear. I was thrilled to hear the lessons learned. There have been a lot of good thinking, a lot of work that's been done Bay-wide by a lot of different jurisdictions. So updates on the lessons learned, updates on the community meetings that were planned and the council. I think those would be great opportune moments to bring together feedback from this board with the conversation in the wider community.
Yeah, they're excellent points. Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't think we need sort of answer the questions right now. I think what we'll do is corral all these comments, get around the room, and see what. Okay, Gary.
How are we doing on time? So we need to. Okay, I'll try and keep it brief. I also, it was very, very inspiring, the presentation. I have to say, I'm really, really encouraged. And I, as a more of a designer mind, I don't completely understand the mechanisms for getting there, but I do understand the diagram for paradigm shift, and I really, want to engage in that. It reminds me very much of, some things that I've read that Jared Diamond wrote about how an individual who's having a crisis or a nervous breakdown is the same as a society or an institution or a government which is having a crisis. It involves honest self-evaluation, commitment to change, throwing out the things that are dragging you down and holding on to the things that are working. And I think you've already described that this isn't a total start over, that you're going to keep the things that are working and you're going to build. And so then when you get into how to make the bridge to projects on the ground, I think it becomes much more difficult for the reasons we've been hearing. Tom is kind of inspiring me to think about how all of the projects come before the board with a short-term goal, short-term financial plan, and a schedule, and everything that you just talked about is about long-term costs. And how can you incorporate, long-term costs to society from a project? So from there, I just want to go to maybe a couple specific examples of project types that we look at all the time where I come away feeling like, we're doing what we can within the rules that exist, but I don't feel like, we're doing enough, or maybe we're rubber stamping something that we shouldn't even be approving, or we don't have the ability to turn it down. And generally speaking, I think for the last couple of years, many of the projects that we've been looking at are in the part of the bay that is going to suffer the biggest impact. So San Mateo, Burlingame, Foster City, so on. And why are we seeing so many projects come before us on the most problematic sites? That's a question I have, and I think I can speculate and try and develop theories, but that's a question. Related to that is the levees that are being built that I don't think is broadly known among the public or even among the board. I'm thinking specifically of Foster City, which is shocking to go down and look at and drive along there and see these 20-foot walls rising in front of homes that formerly had bay views. I'm thinking about Alviso, where there's a massive project underway right now that I don't think anybody knows about unless they have a reason to go to Alviso for some reason. So I asked the question, how is it that those projects can happen independently of the kind of oversight that you're talking about? And finally, I think the other is, as Jacinta mentioned and we've talked about many times, I have in my mind a very separate category for single-family projects and condominium projects on sites that are endangered, because the cost of implementing the 100-year adaptation plan or building a levee or a seawall later falls on a homeowners association. And we do approve projects where we're kicking the can down the road. You're approving a project, a developer is making some money, they're getting out, and the city or the region or somebody is going to be left with a massive, massive cost, which is not in proportion. I mean, those sites, I feel bad about the deferred cost of those. So I will leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah, thanks for all your hard work.
Bob, do you want to wrap up for the DRB?
Yeah, I'll be quick. First, in terms of engaging, well, first let me say thank you for the presentation. This is great. It's nice to be in the room, to be part of this. Really appreciate what you're doing. But in terms of engagement, I think it is really valuable for the boards to be updated and informed about what ECDC is doing so that we can do our jobs. And so I think how we do that, I don't know. I think it is better to have some meetings that make us show up and listen and talk, because a lot of us have lots of things to do, and an email may fall off the list occasionally. Secondly, on resources, I think the ECRB could be utilized to a broader extent. The Foster City levees is an example. I don't think that came in front of the ECRB because it wasn't new bay fill, but it's a lot of big bay fill with geotechnical issues and coastal engineering issues. So, but I think also the other thing to recognize is that the ECRB is working with engineering criteria that are not available at a national or even a state level. We have policy, drivers, and we have sea level rise scenarios, which are science-based by definition, but it's not. There's no ASCE code that I'm aware of for sea level rise for public access versus something over the water versus a shipping terminal or a ferry landing or anything like that. So we're kind of making it up, and in a way, we're leading. I think, but I think the ECRB could help with that perspective if it's useful as you go into these regional plans and stuff. Like, how would that translate to project design criteria? Also, the California Coastal Commission, I think you're in contact with them. There are these coastal groups that talk in the state, but I think that they've had to deal with a lot of similar things. And for example, a lot of different future conditions mapping. I've worked on some of those, and I know Justin's worked on the FEMA maps, and then there's the Cosmos too. So you have all these maps, and what do you do with them? How are they used? And then of course the applicants do something else, and so I think they have a lot of experience from what I understand in that world. It might be worth. It could be some shared benefits. As far as my general comments, I just want to, this is great listening to what the DRB folks said. you know, I really just want to highlight Tom's motivations topic, because what we realize is that paradigm curve, that different people are in different paradigms. Some people are like, okay, I like to be close to the coast, and now I need to build a seawall, and that's it. You know, that's the paradigm. And whereas planning might consider other things, and can be a different. So there's paradigms within paradigms, and it's interesting that how you motivate people, which I think is classically would be to identify those externalities and try to get those internalized into these parcel level local decisions. But, you know, anyway. And then the other thing that Gary mentioned is what I would call legacy issues. I was going to mention this later. You know, so we designed for something and we know it has a life, and, you know, it's got to work economically or politically or whatever. But what happens at the end of that? Because sea level rise is going to continue. And what we're dealing with now are a lot of legacy issues. And so maybe in economics, you have a closeout consideration, but then, you know, you don't want to stop development. So I don't know. I think that's a big challenge, legacy stuff, and how this plan, where does it leave us? Recognizing that sea level is going to keep going up, more than likely. Just a couple of quick comments. So we're living in a moving frame of reference now. The Jacinta's talk about zoning or land use planning. You know, that's moving. The sea's coming up, and the shore's moving in, and the groundwater's coming up, and there's more higher precipitation intensity, so our floodplains are going to expand. So, you know, we have, your plan has the term shoreline. A lot of people use the term shoreline, which is, I guess, an old English navigation thing, which is around mean high water, and that's how our laws are based, and our regulatory framework. And there's the bay on one side and what's not the bay on the other side, but in reality, it's all like a floodplain. And so I don't know if we want to call it, we might want to call it the shore plain or the floodland or the shoreland or something, but you're actually not managing the shoreline necessarily. If you're really being resilient, you're maybe working out into the bay, and maybe also likely considering landward of the shoreline. So what is that? Where is that? Where is that going to be? So those are, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I could go on forever, but I think that's about good enough, probably. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bob, and everybody on the DRB. There's a lot of, I understand and I agree with a lot of things that you're saying. You know, personally, I think this dynamic or this reference frame that Bob just mentioned is really important. If you've got a condo association that is trying to replace a retaining wall, and say the owners are going to be there for 10 years or 15 years, I don't know what the average of home ownership is, but if you're forcing them to think about 100 years into the future and pay for that, it doesn't seem as realistic or equitable if you're forcing that kind of decision and that kind of resource use on them. I almost feel like we need to have economists in the room here talking about how we allocate our resources. If we're going to be talking about shoreline and big changes, there's this whole economic and that kind of, or how you fund any of this, the management of your shoreline. Because I know that things are going to change, but I just, I think that it really, for me, it's the time frame of the change and what you're, if you're going to build a bridge, you're going to want to have 100 years of life, say. But what do you do at the end of that 100 years? Do you just build a new bridge that's higher, or that kind of decision making, I think, has to be part of this process. And I think that in terms of what Bay Adapt does, I would really, like to see that type of thinking incorporated into it. So I'll get out. Well, one more thing. To answer directly these questions, I would really love, I agree, I would really love to have regular update meetings and meetings like this where we are allowed to hear what your progress is and, to be able to offer some input and guidance from our perspectives. And in terms of the resources, Bob mentioned American Society of Civil Engineers or design guidelines. I think they are working on those things, but they are a long way off. We're in technical committees and we're just talking about frameworks right now. I know the Navy is putting together workshops or a workshop on dealing with climate change, not just sea level rise, but the storm intensities and things like that. And that's just an effort that's starting, but the idea is, how do they change their design criteria for their, relatively important structures or facilities to deal with kind of this uncertainty and changing of the climate. So anyway, I'll get off my soapbox now and pass it on to Chris.
Thank you, and thank you for the presentation. It's really great to see the progress that has been made. And it was really good to hear you mention rising groundwater, so it's not just sea level rise. It's really important, but I really also want to urge you to include precipitation-based flooding. I think many communities around the Bay are very focused on protect, building the walls like at Foster City. And if they do not consider all of the sources of flooding, it will be maladaption. We saw in 2023, 13 back-to-back storms, bomb cyclones. Those bring elevated bay water levels and intense precipitation at the same time. So I think it's really important that we bring that in. I also like the components talking about a paradigm shift and anomaly. 2023 is an anomaly. We're in a wonderful bubble here in the Bay Area, but the rest of the world is struggling under intense heat. We're recording record high ocean temperatures, ice sheet melting. We could have passed tipping points. Science right now is going at light speed to try and figure out what's going on. So it's the work that we're doing, that you're doing, is really incredibly important. To go along with the literature on paradigm shift, there is a growing body of literature that's on transformative adaptation, which is very similar to the process that you discussed, but it is specifically focused on climate adaptation, equity-centered. So I would encourage you to explore that base of literature if you haven't done it already. $110 billion, I think that's probably an underestimate. But when you think about it, state level, country level, it's huge. And at the shoreline, where we have all of these compounding hazards, it would really be good to see the guidance embrace planned retreat. I feel like it's an uncomfortable conversation for people to have, but we need to start having more guidance and discussions on planned retreat, because we are going to need to do it maybe by 2050 or sooner. So if we don't start talking about it now, we're not going to be able to get there. I think it's going to need land use changes, policy changes, things that are outside the engineering criteria review board, but I think they're extremely important. And so I would encourage you to include that in the guidance that you're working on.
And with that, I'll pass it to Justin.
Great. So with respect to the first question, I kind of asked myself a separate question of like, what is the relevance of these activities to the ECRB in terms of evaluating a project? And just trying to think of like how these might interface with the project level review. And to some extent, I think some of the things I noted, maybe there's some sorting out of like what's the responsibility of BCDC staff versus the ECRB, and that's fine. But I was trying to kind of imagine a future world, a future ECRB meeting where a sub-regional implementation plan exists and we're evaluating a project that kind of fits within that context. And so I think, one thing that would probably come up would be sort of how to evaluate an individual project within the context of a plan. Is it consistent? How does it work with other projects in adjacent shoreline areas? Thinking about the feasibility of that project with respect, within the plan and its adaptability and things like that. And then also thinking about, is the project consistent with and compatible with the adaptation pathway that has been laid out in the implementation plan. So those are a few things that came to mind there. With respect to the providing input on, say, development of the planning guidelines, I think that potentially there could be a role for the ECRB to maybe provide input, like to the extent that the planning guidance would include, say, suggestions on different types of adaptation options that could be considered in an implementation plan. Maybe the ECRB could provide input on feasibility or suitability of different actions along different parts of the shoreline within the bay, for example. And then with respect to the second question on other resources, I'm sure BCDC staff are as aware or more aware of, things within the Bay Area, but I might just throw out that there's probably other non-Bay precedents that could be looked at in other parts of the country where, maybe it's like state level or regional level plans that have been developed, but just looking at how those kind of regional plans have been laid out and, just kind of broadening the perspective. I know the Bay Area is usually a leader in this space, but there may be other examples that could be pulled in as well. So yeah, I think those are my comments. Thanks.
Yeah, I'd just like to reiterate a point that Rod made about the struggles we have with how to address different types of properties consistently. And in my line of work, we work on a variety of projects from new developments where we're, or I should say redeveloping 2,000 feet of shoreline, transforming an industrial wharf into a pedestrian promenade, or individual homeowners or HOAs that are trying to do repairs, or large industrial facilities or petrochemical facilities around that maybe have more money and can afford things, and we need to find a way to address these consistently and be able to apply policy to the different types of projects. And that's where I think we as a board struggle, and I think that's something that we'd like to get some guidance from ECDC on how to address. Thanks.
Yeah, talking as a geotechnical engineer to a non-geotechnical type of topic of sea level rise, I do have a number of comments, I guess, as representing the Engineering Criteria Review Board. It seems like engineering criteria sea level rise topic per se might be a tractable problem. I'm not sure that the policy issues are as easily tractable. A couple of questions that I have that I think should be addressed and be useful for the engineering criteria review for the ECRB to have in hand is it was talked about best available science. And I'm curious, how narrow or broad is the best available science? Is there consensus? Is there a lot of dissent? It was mentioned earlier, the idea that maybe the boards are overreaching. What does that mean? Are we able to, and if these are non-mandatory issues, is there a number that's mandatory that's a mandatory number? So many feet in 2050, so many feet in 2075, so many feet in 2100, and what is the design life? Who decides the design life? If you have a homeowner that's going to live there an average of 15 years, we normally think of 50 years, but 50 years is kind of a stand-in number that says if it lasts 50 years, it'll last forever. I mean, so that's kind of as far as we can imagine. And that's basically stable. But that's different with sea level rise because 50 years from now is different than 25 years from now and different than 75 years from now. So somehow someone needs to start thinking about what does, who decides design life and what is mandated about that. If we're talking about engineering criteria is a mandate almost anonymously, I think. And so if we're saying a lot of these issues are not mandates, well, what is engineering criteria then? I had a question about probabilistic sorts of studies, maybe if there's uncertainty about what sea level rise means. As a geotechnical engineer, we deal with earthquakes, and earthquakes are, in a sense, a fuzzy type of number that who knows, how do you put your finger on what's going to happen? And we put our finger on that we thought that the Hayward was going to go again 10 years ago, and we're not there yet. So but we have to design for it still. But maybe there's a way that we come up and say, this is the median number, but we want you to design for 2050, which is the one sigma, the mean plus 1 sigma value, and that's what single-family residences, or that's what subdivisions up to 10 units mean, or that's what a seawall around Foster City, for crying out loud. And, Ray Seed used to say, engineers, doctors have it easy. They just risk killing people one at a time. Engineers risk, cities. So the criteria for Foster City is what's the statistical number that you've got on that? It shouldn't be a median number. It's probably not a 1 sigma number. It's probably a 2 sigma number or something like that that says we think that this is really, something we really don't want to see a problem with levees around Foster City. And then I have a question. Some of these things are not mandated. What does a permit mean if it's not mandated? Or what does a permit denial mean if it's not mandated? I think that's how we need to get towards, figure out what is mandated and then what is incentive. I mean, I'm an engineer. I don't deal with it. An ECRB number at least. But, the criteria and mandates are something that makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you. A lot of very good exchange here. First of all, it's almost 50 years to a day. I first got introduced to BCDC through a guy named George Mader, who's a policy planner in the Bay Area. And at that time, the mission was to keep the bay from getting filled. Right? The mission was, no more fills. But I think what we're talking about is how do we keep the bay from flooding us out? And so the point that it's really not shoreline, it's the coastal flood zone that we really have to consider and what is going to happen within it. And that requires a regional approach. As an engineer, the engineering solution, if you want 20-foot walls, we can build 20-foot walls. Do we want to live in an area that's basically surrounded by large moats? That's an option, but I don't think it's a desirable option. So, hard engineering solutions are possible. The soft solutions, they require regional approach. You really have to start thinking regionally, the jurisdictions, somehow we have to get the jurisdictions together to think about it holistically. You can't have San Mateo having one approach and Burlingame another approach and call it perfect solution for everybody. Obviously, one of those, they both may work, but they don't lead to the same outcome. So as I said, from the engineering standpoint, in a way, once the societal criteria are established, it's really what does the society want? What do we want this to be? And keep in mind, it's not just the bay or sea level that's going up. If the base level goes up, the whole delta goes up. Okay? You got islands, you got flooding there. It's a system, and so I heard suggestions of barriers in the bay, like Venice. I'm sorry, this is not Venice. This is a much larger area. Barriers, for a few years might work, but we have a winter like this one, not going to work. Okay, so that's one thing that I was thinking. So looking at common approach and the issue of 100-year horizon, that's an interesting point. San Francisco water system is more than 100 years old, still working. It's amazingly East Bay mud the same way. It's amazing what was done with not thinking about 100 years, but has to last. So what we find is a lot of these engineering, infrastructure solutions, they acquire life of their own, and we have to sort of think about it. We have the Bayshore Freeway network on both sides. At some point, there will have to be seawalls around all of those, or they'll have to be elevated and become the levees that everybody's talking about. So I think I like this idea of engagement and especially looking at it holistically. I think that's why, because we need to, as engineers, really, the society needs to provide some guidance on what is the outcome that we desire. Because that can, in the end, it's money, I'm sorry, whether it's 100 billion or more, but yes, we can do it, but we have to have a common purpose. So that's the way I see that, as an engineer, I can help in that process. But I need to have some, buy-in from somebody who says, yes, we'd like to have your help, rather than being there and saying, no, yet, you cannot do this because. Thank you.
I think the bad part of sitting at the end of the table is everybody who's so smart basically steal your thunder. But I think the elephant in the room is a global issue that needs to be addressed on a project level. You can never do that unless you tell people, hey, you are submitting a permit to BCDC to do whatever development you want. You have to consider 5 foot of sea level rise. That's the only way that you can address it, because you cannot have this being a mandatory or voluntary. You have to address that. If you want to talk about incentives, you have to say what they are. Are they tax incentives? Are they insurance incentives? Are they some sort of a credit against some other people, almost like trading carbon incentives? So I think engineering-wise, like Nick said, is easy. You put a stupid-looking barrier in front of the beauty of the bay, and yeah, it won't flood your development. But that's not what any of us want. So I think what I think is going on here is really just a forum to discuss a global issue, and how do you bring it to a local project level. And I don't think you can. This has to be addressed regionally. There is no other way you can handle this. And how that is done is really the $110 billion question, which I think is probably a lot more than that, maybe by a factor of 10. So that's my 2 cents sitting at the end of the table. Thank you.
Well, I mean, you're very good at stealing my thunder. Anyway, thank you very much for the presentation. Most of what I had written down were things that Ramin just talked about. The only thing I would add to it is also add what Chris shared, that it's not just sea level rise, but, you know, flooding from other sources is also part of it. What is heartwarming for me is the fact that this thing is being looked at on a global level, in a holistic kind of way. I think the issue of, you know, trying to determine what we bring to it is, we are far from that. We have to get to a point of basically the only way that you can deal with sea level rise, like Ramin said, has to be regional. Now, even if there was a mandate that if you are developing a property on a shoreline and you have to put in a 10-foot high wall, well, the sea is not going to respect that 10-foot high wall. It's going to go around it, right? So you have to cover the whole shoreline, or you have to cover the whole region. So I think that society would have to basically decide that this is a crisis which affects us all, and be committed to approaching it on a societal, regional, national level. I mean, we talk about climate change. I mean, part of the challenge that they've had is that different countries, you know, have different levels of commitment. But the wind doesn't respect boundaries, right? So if we in the U.S. are establishing all these policies to deal with climate change, but China is not, or Mexico is not, I mean, we are not being protected. So there has to be a sense of things, there being an agreement, you know, on a societal level, that this is so important that we are willing to commit resources to dealing with it on a global type of level. I think you talked about reimagining our role. I think it's so true, because the things we do now mean nothing if we had to look at things on a global type of level. How we would come in would be joining with everybody else. If society is committed to dealing with the issue on a societal level, we bring in our expertise, you know, in coming up with solutions to address the problem on that level. Thank you.
Gail, do you have another comment?
No, that was, I was raising my hand on behalf of my colleague, Mr. French here earlier, since we are sharing a camera.
Gary.
Very quick. I think 15 years ago, I attended a talk about how the managed retreat would be solved by insurance companies. And I think in the last couple of weeks, we have seen that it's had a big impact as they pull out. And that is something that I think, you know, transcends our ability. I think it addresses some of the other things we're hearing. You know, we can say as much as we want what we think is the right thing to do, but I think identifying what mechanisms there are to bring into your policy evaluations or to inform people who are investing in the shoreline, maybe there's something there. I would love to hear if anybody else is more knowledgeable about that than me.
I'm just looking at timeline here because, Rod, you might want to weigh in too. But Ashley, there's been just so much really important feedback from everyone. I think we could easily extend this for another couple of hours, going backwards and forwards, as we focus our minds with particularly some of the latter comments. But what should our plan be? It's 5 o'clock, so what do you suggest?
Next on the agenda is adjournment. I think we heard very clearly that everyone is interested in engaging in this process more in the future, and so perhaps we can schedule more dialogues like this. I will look to Larry.
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, I'm a very frequent attendant of the DRB and UCRB meetings, and always get to hear very incisive comments at the project level. And it's just interesting to be talking about such a big issue and hear these high-level thoughts, and just really just giving us a lot to think about. So I just wanted to say thank you for all the comments.
Yeah, I mean, as much as it would be great fun to talk about this for another couple of hours, I think you probably have a lot to digest, and we probably also have a lot to digest. I mean, we both were taking just pages and pages of notes. Your comments were all just so insightful and thoughtful. Some stuff that we have thought about, and some stuff we haven't yet. So I'm not 100% sure how we want to proceed forward in terms of coming up with maybe just a briefing schedule, or identify key points where you know, we can bring you just really specific pieces of information. But it does sound like it would be really mutually beneficial to continue this conversation. Maybe just not tonight.
Can I just make a conclusion remark just on behalf of the DRB? I mean, I think you are already making really important progress. And, you know, if we think about the beginning of the cycle of a project where a developer comes to you, mainly a developer comes to you, and they have a project they want to develop. And I think it would be really helpful for, even at this point, to distill something quite simple from everything that's being studied at a more macro level, just to distill to the developer that, you know, and use language like, even though it's not figured out in details, but, you know, that, you know, shoreline adaptation that adopts a natural approach is something that you're going to view very favorably. You know, there might be 3 or 4, keep it simple, but, you know, based on what you've heard today, just things that you could already start in that first meeting with a developer that might be helpful, because I completely agree, you know, these global macro issues are something that at a project level we can't necessarily impact, but we can impact, you know, the next 25 or 50 years, and I think we should, you know, within the realm of what we can do. So I think I just would like to suggest that we, you know, that we move ahead. We don't sort of wait for 2 years before these conversations are held with potential developers and projects.
So, you know, in my day job, I'm kind of involved in 7.5 miles, or protecting 7.5 miles of shoreline. I see how big a job that is. I see how hard our staff and our consultants are working to make this all fit, right? And the amount of resources involved are just mind blowing. And so this is all, I think, really great. But it feels like, to me, I see it on a day-to-day basis, and it feels like just an absolutely impossible task. But but there are people who are running the program who've got this idea in their head that it's going to work somehow. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I'm very hopeful, even though personally maybe I'm like overwhelmed. I think this is all super, it's a very noble pursuit, right? And I really encourage the staff to think about the things that we've brought up. I mean, I still think that, the timing of sea level rise, of what it means, 20 years down the line, 50 years down the line, 100 years down the line, that at some point, even the tallest, 8-foot, 9-foot, 10-foot wall that you build is going to be overrun at some point. And you've made all of these decisions now or in the near future that are going to have to play out, and the next generations are going to have to live with that. And so, I think it really does require a lot of consideration and care on our part right now to make sure that we're making, the best decisions that we can, but also have flexibility so that people can pivot, in 20 years or 25 years. So, sorry, I'll get off my soapbox again.
So if I can, a couple things. I think the next step is to have a stiff drink. And I mean that sincerely, because this is the kind of discussion that, thankfully, Rod just said something at the end that I think we all need to hear. There are optimists here. I think all of us are optimists here, because I don't think you would volunteer for BCDC unless you were optimistic about the way the Bay Area can change and the way the Bay Area needs to change. So with that being said, I don't think we have to have a Zoloft, concession out the door. I think there's a reason that we can be optimistic. My suggestion is that Dana and Ethan will compare notes and work hard to try to make something out of those notes that actually gives us some type of organizational framework to use in terms of what the questions are that are really raised by this. Ashley and Jen will certainly be part of that. And we'll share that with the chairs of the DRB and ECRB to make sure that they think that that's somewhat at least consistent with what you heard. So at least we're working off of a framework that we can use. And then what we'll have to do as staff is figure out how those issues are going to be raised and when they're going to be raised in this Bay Adapt discussion. And as we do that, as we see that framework, we will then come back to you all in preparation for that, so that you all are prepared for those kinds of discussions to be had, not only probably as part of your meetings, but as part of, the Commissioner Working Group on Rising Sea Level, to which you will all, to which you are all going to be notified, and the like. And as those issues bubble up to the surface, we want to make sure that you're involved with at least understanding how the Commission's viewing this. So that's sort of the logistical way that I see this happening. I will end by saying this. Regulatory agencies such as BCDC are created in order to provide certainty to the public. The FDA exists so that the pills we take in the morning don't kill us, they actually solve things. We get into airplanes that are certified not to fall out of the sky, and the pilots are trained to make sure that doesn't happen. BCDC is a regulatory agency that is facing an environment that is uncertain. And permits are contracts, and contracts are based upon some kind of certainty. And so one of the things that we need to think through with you all, and with all due respect, I think the engineers were really totally on target on this, because they see certainty. That's what engineers do, right? You can build a wall that's going to last for 110 years, as long as we give you the specs or the idea. You can build whatever, you'll figure it out. But we don't know what's going to be like in 20 years or 80 years. And for someone who has a 19-year-old kid and hopes that his grandkids, you know, live in a prosperous Bay Area, we have to be adaptable. So all that basically is a mishmash of, I don't know how we're going to do this, but we're going to depend upon your input as we move forward to try to figure out how to do it best. So with that, I want to thank you all for participating, because it's something that we haven't asked you to do before, and now it's something we're going to ask you to do more. So we thank you for your help.
Jacinta, would you call adjournment?
Yes, I propose we adjourn the meeting. Can someone second me? Thank you, Tom. Meeting adjourned.